Back in the day in America, when people thought of clowns, they pictured laughter, childhood innocence, and the dazzling lights of the circus. Painted faces, bright costumes, and those big red noses meant to bring nothing but joy. But slowly, that image twisted. Behind the fake smile, there was something off, something unsettling. Clowns stopped being funny and started to feel wrong. They became a symbol of fear in pop culture. And in Chicago, during the 1970s, one clown took that fear and made it real. His name was Pogo. But he wasn't here to make kids laugh. He was hiding something darker, much darker. Because behind that painted smile was a cold-blooded killer. That's why the name John Wayne Gacy still chills America to this day. One of the most terrifying serial killers in history. A monster dressed as a clown. Part 1: The Childhood of a Killer. Born in 1942 in Chicago, John Wayne Gacy grew up in a household that, on the surface, seemed ordinary, but behind closed doors was filled with darkness. His father, John Stanley Gacy, was a World War II veteran, a heavy drinker, and a violent man. He would regularly unleash his anger on his family through brutal beatings. To him, young John was nothing but weak, useless, and undeserving of praise. Words like failure and worthless were hammered into the boy's mind, leaving deep scars that never healed. In stark contrast stood his mother, Marion, a gentle woman who tried to protect her son from his father's wrath. But her efforts were powerless. No matter how much she tried to shield him, John always found himself facing his father's cruelty. Growing up in that twisted environment, the boy developed a desperate craving for love and recognition. But what he received instead was humiliation and violence. On top of the emotional wounds, Gacy's physical health was fragile. As a child, he was constantly sick, hospitalized multiple times for heart and brain conditions. To his peers, he was the weird kid, too weak to play sports, too odd to truly belong. He became an easy target for bullies, further deepening his feelings of isolation. It was within this loneliness that something darker began to grow. Instead of finding comfort in friendships, Gacy turned inward, developing strange and secretive habits. His sexual curiosity surfaced at an early age, but it twisted into something abnormal, something perverse. Alongside this came a growing obsession with control, an urge to dominate others. Piece by piece, the foundation for something monstrous was being laid. An abusive father, a sickly childhood, a constant sense of rejection and alienation. All of it was shaping John Wayne Gacy into something far more terrifying than anyone could have imagined. From the shadows of his childhood home in Chicago, the seeds of a killer had already been planted. Part 2: The Man with Two Faces. As John Wayne Gacy grew older, the shy, sickly boy disappeared, replaced by a man who, to the outside world, seemed like the very definition of success. He built a small business in construction and contracting, painting houses, repairing buildings, even hosting neighborhood parties. His work earned him respect, and his charm made him seem trustworthy. To neighbors, Gacy was the reliable man next door, the one you could count on. But Gacy wasn't just a businessman. He threw himself into local politics, joining the Democratic Party, hosting gatherings for politicians, and shaking hands with community leaders. He became the kind of citizen people pointed to with admiration. He looked like a model American, friendly, hardworking, deeply involved in his community. No one could have guessed the monster that lived beneath that polished exterior. And then there was Pogo the Clown. Dressed in colorful makeup, a red nose, and a painted-on grin, Gacy transformed himself into a character adored by children. He performed at birthday parties, hospitals, and community events, bringing laughter and smiles. To everyone watching, he was harmless entertainment, a funny clown who loved making kids laugh. But behind the mask, Pogo was something far more sinister. That costume wasn't just for show, it was the perfect disguise. It gave Gacy access to the most innocent victims, and more importantly, it helped him hide in plain sight. And then there was the house on Summerdale Avenue. To visitors, it looked like any other suburban home, a modest, ordinary place in the quiet neighborhoods of Chicago. But beneath the floors, hidden in the crawl space, it held a gruesome secret. Over time, that house would transform into a burial ground, a hidden graveyard where dozens of lives were swallowed up by the darkness Gacy carried within. This was John Wayne Gacy, the businessman, the political volunteer, the happy clown, and the silent predator. A man with two faces, one the world trusted, and the other they could never have imagined. Part 3. The killing machine John Wayne Gacy was not just a murderer, he was a cold, calculated machine of death. The lure. He preyed on teenage boys, often those looking for part-time jobs. Gacy would promise them money, offer work, and sometimes invite them back to his house. Once inside, the magic trick began. Gacy would show off a handcuff routine, locking himself up, then slipping free. Curious, the boys would try it, only to realize too late that it was a trap. Once the cuffs snapped shut, only Gacy held the key. The ritual of murder. Bound and helpless, the victims were subjected to hours of psychological and physical torment. Gacy would assault them, humiliate them, and finally strangle them, sometimes with a rope, other times with his bare hands. To him, it wasn't chaos, it was ritual. Killing became methodical, almost mechanical. Disposal of bodies, his modest home on 8213 Summerdale Avenue, slowly turned into a graveyard. In the crawl space beneath the house, Gacy buried over 29 bodies. When space ran out, he dumped others into the Des Plaines River. The stench of death eventually seeped through the walls, but somehow, for years, he managed to deflect suspicion. A wave of disappearances. By the mid-1970s, teenage boys across Chicago began vanishing without explanation. Families were desperate, the community terrified. And yet, nobody suspected the cheerful neighbor, the man who dressed up as a clown to entertain children. That contrast between mask and monster was what made Gacy's crimes so horrifying. Part 4. The turning point of the investigation. The disappearance of Robert Peist, 1978. On December 11, 1978, 15-year-old Robert Peist vanished after finishing a shift at a local pharmacy. He told his mother he was going to meet a man named Gacy about a potential job, but he never returned. That was the moment the investigation finally had its breakthrough. Surveillance and search warrant police quickly identified Gacy as a prime suspect. They began tailing him day and night. The first search of his house on 8213 Summerdale didn't uncover bodies, but it revealed disturbing evidence. Rings, handcuffs, clothing that didn't belong to him. Most chilling of all was the foul stench, like the odor of rotting flesh, seeping up from beneath the floorboards. Still, it wasn't enough to arrest him outright. Investigators tightened their watch, documenting his every move. They noticed erratic behavior, heavy drinking, signs of paranoia, as though his double life was beginning to unravel. The confession and the crawl space. On December 21st, Gacy was finally arrested. Under pressure, he broke. Whether out of exhaustion or the realization that his secrets could no longer stay hidden, he confessed. Gacy admitted to killing over 30 people and directed police to the burial sites. When investigators entered the crawl space under his home, they descended into a nightmare. The ground was packed with decomposing bodies, bones tangled together in the damp earth. Even seasoned detectives recoiled at the sight. It was a house of horrors, one that revealed the full, monstrous scale of John Wayne Gacy's crimes. Part 5. The trial that shook the nation. A media frenzy. In 1980, Chicago became the stage for one of the most infamous trials in American history. Hundreds of reporters flooded the courthouse, and crowds lined up outside just to catch a glimpse of John Wayne Gacy, the man accused of murdering at least 33 young men and boys. The atmosphere was electric, almost like a circus. But instead of laughter, it was fueled by horror and curiosity. The defense strategy. Gacy's legal team pulled a desperate move. They claimed he suffered from multiple personality disorder. They painted a picture of two Johns, Good John and Bad John. According to the defense, only Bad John committed the crimes, while Good John was just another victim of his fractured mind. Gacy even played along, shifting between calm and erratic during the hearings, as if to prove their theory. The hope was to spare him the death penalty by casting him as mentally ill rather than monstrously evil. Overwhelming evidence. But the prosecution came prepared with a mountain of evidence. More than 29 bodies dug up from beneath his crawl space. Belongings of the victims found in his home. Eyewitnesses, neighbors, co-workers, even former employees testified, painting the same picture. A calculating predator who knew exactly what he was doing. The prosecutors tore the split personality defense to shreds, calling it a cheap performance. They argued Gacy wasn't insane. He was methodical, manipulative, and chillingly aware of his crimes. Public outrage. Inside the courtroom, families of the victims wept as the gruesome details were read aloud. Outside, newspapers published daily updates, fueling national outrage. The public couldn't reconcile the image of Pogo the Clown with the monster who had turned his home into a personal graveyard. The verdict, after 5 grueling weeks of testimony, the jury took only a few hours to decide. John Wayne Gacy was found guilty of 33 counts of murder. In March 1980, he was sentenced to death. The courtroom erupted. For the victims' families, it was not victory, but closure. For the rest of America, it marked the end of a nightmare and the beginning of Gacy's transformation into one of the most notorious figures in criminal history. Part 6. The Years Behind Bars. A Cold Attitude. After his death sentence, John Wayne Gacy was sent to Menard Correctional Center. What shocked the public most was his demeanor. He showed no remorse. Instead, Gacy seemed to adapt comfortably to prison life. He spent his time painting, chatting with guards, and even became something of a celebrity among inmates. The clown paintings. Perhaps the most disturbing detail was the artwork he produced behind bars. Many of his paintings featured Pogo the Clown, the very disguise he once used to mask his crimes. These paintings were sold at auctions, with some collectors buying them as morbid souvenirs, while others bought them only to burn them in protest. Either way, the paintings symbolized society's disgust. How could a murderer profit, even indirectly, from the icon of his evil? A dark celebrity. During more than a decade on death row, Gacy received thousands of letters from twisted admirers. Some asked for autographs, some wanted his artwork, and shockingly, some women even professed love for him. Gacy reveled in this attention, feeding his narcissism and treating himself not as a monster, but as a dark legend. The final day. On May 10th, 1994, John Wayne Gacy was led into the execution chamber. Crowds gathered outside, and the media reported every second of the event. When asked for his final words, he sneered, "Kiss my ass." With that last act of defiance, Gacy left the world exactly as he had lived in it, cruel, arrogant, and unrepentant. Part 7th, Legacy and Haunting Impact. The Fear of Clowns. After Gacy's crimes were revealed, the image of clowns was forever tainted. Birthday parties and parades were no longer innocent fun. Parents began to hesitate before hiring a clown, and children, instead of laughing, sometimes cried at the sight of painted faces. Coulrophobia, the fear of clowns, exploded into public consciousness and became a cultural shorthand for unease. Pop culture influence. Gacy's legacy bled into fiction. Stephen King openly admitted that Pennywise in it was influenced by the real-life killer clown. Every time Pennywise smiled, audiences were reminded not just of fiction, but of Gacy's horrifying grin. The Joker, with his grotesque laughter and unpredictable violence, became another echo of the same archetype. Shows like American Horror Story leaned into the imagery of clown killers, making it a recurring horror trope. What once was a symbol of joy had become a universal shorthand for terror. Societal and legal impact. The Gacy case also exposed alarming flaws in law enforcement. How could a man with a prior record of sexual assault, repeatedly accused by neighbors and employees, evade capture while dozens went missing around him? The outrage forced systemic changes. Police agencies improved cooperation across jurisdictions, missing person protocols became more rigorous, and sex offender registries gained far stricter oversight. The lesson was grim but clear. Complacency costs lives. A dark celebrity. Even after his execution, Gacy remained a twisted figure of fascination. His prison paintings, many depicting clowns, fetched money at auctions, some bought by collectors, others bought to be burned in protest. Documentaries, books, and podcasts kept his story alive. He became more than a killer. He became a dark legend, the embodiment of evil hiding in plain sight. The final warning. John Wayne Gacy's story endures not just because of the horror of his crimes, but because of what he represents. The idea that monsters don't always look like monsters. Sometimes they wear the friendliest of smiles. Sometimes they put on makeup and entertain children. And sometimes they live next door. That is why, decades after his death, Gacy is still remembered, not just as a murderer, but as the eternal symbol of the mask that hides pure evil.